you have a lot of questions that we gave you from a series that Odd McKee had written years and years ago. We're not covering all those questions in our class time, but we are covering the 10 kind of, I don't want to call them discussion questions, but the 10 questions that you kind of actually give a full answer to, not the fill in the blank, not the true false. Those were running on the screen when you came in. If you wanted to check your answers against my answers, you want to argue about it later, come find me. It'll be fine. If you had something different than I had, we'll try to resolve that. But anyway, those answer keys are running on the screen prior to any time we're going to discuss the summary of a chapter. And we'll get into those questions, those 10 questions that we'll talk about and then move out of chapter 4 together this evening. But if you would, let's bow our heads together. Let's share in a word of prayer before we begin. Our Father in heaven, thank you for the day that you blessed us with, this beautiful day and an opportunity to assemble here to share in a study of your word, to appreciate the wonderful message that you shared through this writer of Hebrews, and the importance of appreciating the greatness of Jesus, and that when we've dedicated ourselves to Him, we've prioritized the most important thing that we could do in this life. And Father, strengthen us to have the courage to stay steadfast as the encouragement from the book brings, and give us an honest and open heart to be receptive to the lessons learned even this evening. Guide us and direct us in all that's good and right in your sight, and we pray this through Christ's name. Amen. All right, so real quick, and again, just a summary, we talked several classes on chapter 4, but these are the questions that were part of your answer or your question sheets that we said we would come back to each week or each time we do this. But after reading chapters 3 and 4, name the 3 rests under consideration. There are basically 3 of them that get referenced. Okay, Promised Land's 1, and technically, chronologically, it's in the middle. What's the first one, chronologically? The Sabbath, right? It references the Sabbath rest that God had after He creates the world. So that would be chronologically the first. The second is the Israelites going into the Promised Land and missing out on that, the first generation of them. And then what's the third? Eternal, right? Us, the one that includes us, and the one that included whom? Yeah, the audience, right, that letter was being written to, and the importance of that. And so we talked about, really in chapter 4, rest is the overall theme, right? Rest is the repetitive theme that kept coming back over and over in that chapter. Does verse 1 apply in every generation to all Christians? What's that? Does verse 1 apply in every generation to all Christians? Yes, right? The idea is that it's a weird, right, depending on what you're looking at, but I think that the rest under consideration in verse 1 has transitioned to the eternal rest that God wants for those Hebrew folks that He's writing to appreciate, and for us as well. So it has a much more general feel to it than just that Promised Land rest or even the Sabbath. For that matter. How could the gospel have been preached unto them, Israelites? We briefly talked about this a couple weeks ago.
Verse 2 says in the same way that it was preached to us.
Okay, in the same way it was preached to us. By definition, how can that happen? The gospel is good news, so it wouldn't matter, right? If it's good news from God, it's good news from God. There's some very specific thoughts that the New Testament gospel has in mind, but by pure definition, good news is good news. Gospel is gospel, and they could hear it in both ways. So they can hear it in the sense that they're looking forward to it. They can hear it in the sense that it is good news. And so there are a variety of ways that word would work, and we talked about those in our discussion. Is there any reason to believe that the days of Genesis 1 and 2 were not 24-hour days? Now, there's no reason to believe that. We didn't have any discussion at all on that topic. We talked a little bit about creation, but we didn't dive down that road. But the evening and the day were, right, and that was day 1, and in the day 2, and there's no indication whatsoever. And God rested on the 7th, and then ultimately that becomes the what? The Sabbath, and they were to honor how many of those? All of them, right? They were, remember the Sabbath. That was the instruction, the law. Remember the Sabbath, and the reasoning for it was the day that God rested himself. And so there's nothing in the text that would indicate that that's not 24-hour periods. Who led the Israelites across the Jordan River to occupy the land of promise? That was Joshua. Who else is there in terms of leadership? Caleb's there, but Joshua was the one that takes the forefront of that. And there was a question in those other set of questions, and we talked about it last week, that verse 8 kind of got to catch a word translation issue there, in a reference to Joshua in that moment. About what rest does Revelation 14:13 speak? Okay, and so you see the connectivities. Does Matthew 11:28 promise rest to a Christian here and now? Okay, no, it's not about, right, it's not about the moment we're in. It's about what we're pressing forward to that should be on our minds as it relates to those things. Is it possible that some Christians have started resting before time to rest? Oh, there's an interesting question. Yeah, it's absolutely possible, right? It's absolutely possible that people have stopped, because what's the definition of rest? And it was again in your other questions if you did those. To stop working, right? By kind of definition, to rest means to cease working. And if we're already at rest, we have stopped working too soon, right? Too short, which is what he was trying to get them to see, right? The Israelites stopped short of completing their work and taking the promised land. And that's the picture that he wanted them to appreciate. What passage in this chapter would destroy the notion that God's word is a dead letter? Yeah, why verse 12? Because the word of God is quick, it's alive, it's powerful, sharper than any two-edged sword. How or through what medium would a Christian come to the throne of grace? Okay, so we come obediently, we come boldly, right? There at the end of chapter 4. And by what means do we do that? Prayer, right? Grace is how we receive the benefit. But at the end of that text, he's emphasizing that because Jesus is now a high priest who sits at the throne of God, come boldly to that throne. I'm cautious not to, because it was again part of those other questions you had, but I'm cautious not to say that's the only way we come boldly before the throne of God, right? Because the imagery is Jesus is the high priest, Jesus is the King of Kings, he's all of these things that the writer's been illustrating. Come boldly to him because of that. Approach him. And sometimes that's in prayer, sometimes that's through our obedience, sometimes that's in our effort to serve and honor him as king. Approaching him to receive that mercy and grace, I just want to make sure we understand, is more than just words in a prayer. It's about genuine boldness in coming to him as the high priest and honoring him as such, and maybe has a little bigger connotation than we sometimes might think. Okay, so let's look at chapter 5. That helps set the stage and remind us of what was talked about in chapter 4. Let's jump to chapter 5. So, chapter 5, at least for the first two-thirds, is going to reemphasize this conversation about Jesus as a high priest. And he's going to illustrate it in a couple of different ways and emphasize it in a couple of different ways. Now, real quick, by the way, why even have this conversation about how Jesus has become this different high priest?
People are trying to get back to the old system.
Okay, so they've been trying to go back into that Old Testament ways, and he's trying to encourage them out of that. And he says, why would you do that when you've got the perfect high priest to now serve, and who's now serving and honoring you? And we talked about that last week, that he's a high priest that not only is offering the sacrifice, but is, right? Was the sacrifice. He's very different in that capacity. For every high priest taken from among men is ordained for men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins, who can have compassion on the ignorant and on them that are out of the way, that for that he himself also is compassed with infirmity. Now, the contemporary high priests in the days of Jesus and those immediate apostles following and in this time period, they seem to indicate not a whole lot of concern for the people, right? There's not necessarily a connectivity that should have been expected. But generally speaking, the high priest was selected from among whom? And generally, Levi specifically, but and the high priest through the Aaron, right? But what's the context here? They're what? They're men. They're men who can understand the hardships, the difficulties. They can understand the need to be compassionate. They can appreciate the need to address people understanding the same infirmities and difficulties and challenges that the people experience, they experience as well. And they're able to offer these sacrifices for sins and infirmities with a very connected approach. And by reason hereof he ought, as for the people, so also for himself, to offer for sins. That's the difference, right, between those Old Testament high priests and Jesus. One of the significant differences is that they offered sacrifices on behalf of whom? First themselves and the people. They were all, including the high priest, in need of the benefit of the sacrifice. Did Jesus need anything from his sacrifice? No, Jesus didn't need anything from his sacrifice. There was nothing in him that needed forgiveness, no sin, no transgression. Did he need to be offering himself on behalf of himself? He's very different in that way. And though some of these things don't necessarily get verbalized immediately, it's the general argument of the distinction that the writer wants them to make about how that Old Testament high priesthood worked and how the new high priest Jesus is very different. Similar because they were men, so Jesus came in the form of man. We've already talked about that in the letters, in the early part of the letter. But different in that they offered sacrifice on behalf of their own sins and for the sins of the people. Jesus only offers himself as a sacrifice for the people. Add verse 4, and then we'll slow down. And no man taketh this honor unto himself, but he that is called of God, as was Aaron. So, did you run to be elected high priest? Right? Did you put your name on a ballot? Can you tell me anything biblically about how the high priest was selected? I'm not trying to trick you. I'm just trying to get you to think maybe for a minute. Say it one more time, Bob.
He was chosen from his brothers in the tribe.
Okay, so they had to come from whom? It had to come from Aaron, right? They had to come from Aaron. That's the order. Leviticus chapter 21. If you want to read it, some of it, I'm not going to read to you tonight. But if you want a reference point, go back and read Leviticus chapter 21. And by the way, it's very, very direct kind of language in that chapter about it couldn't even just be anybody of the lineage of Aaron. It had to be people that men who fit a very peculiar set of circumstances. And in fact, go back and read it, they couldn't have scurvy. They couldn't have a bum leg. They couldn't be blind. Right? There's all kinds of things, and you can read, there's 10 or 12 verses in Leviticus 21 that describe that the priest who would put an unblemished sacrifice on the altar before God would he himself physically be unblemished. It's if you were to read it out loud today, you'd probably get some interesting looks from people that because it almost sounds discriminatory, right? It sounds like, but what I just simply want you to appreciate that the purposes of God to match the servant who would offer those sacrifices to the sacrifice itself was part of what God was developing in terms of how those sacrifices would be offered. What's interesting to me, though, is we have the guidelines, the restrictions. So we know they got to be down from the bloodline of Aaron, from biblical narrative. We know there are restrictions, even with that, of who can serve in that capacity. But can you show me any text that shows one being selected? Can you show? Is there a Bible passage that shows one being selected, or showing us one taking over, or somebody dies, one dies, and the next one steps in? Is there a Bible reference to any kind of continuity of high priest? One died, next one stepped in. That one died, next one stepped in. One failed, stepped away, next one steps in. Do we have any examples of that?
The only thing we have is, I'm probably saying the wrong name, Zechariah, who was John the Baptist's father. He was the high priest that year. And he went in and he was told, that his wife was going to become pregnant.
Go back and look at him. I'm not sure he was...
He was the priest
Correct.
that year.
But a different role, I believe. I don't believe... Somebody check me on that. Zechariah, John the Baptist's father, was he the high priest? That's the question. Was he the high priest at the time? Go back and look at it. He had a purpose. There was a specific priestly role he was performing, and it was his duty that year to perform it. There are two high priests going on in the days of Jesus. Who are they? And Caiaphas, right? They're labeled as the high priest during the time of Jesus. And is the first. He's the one that actually came through the lineage of Aaron and had rightful role as the high priest. In fact, he's the high priest that Jesus gets brought to first, right? When the Jews take Jesus, they bring him to Annas first, and then they go over to the guy the Romans had put in charge, Caiaphas, who happens to be who to Annas? Anybody remember that? That was his son-in-law, okay? So Caiaphas was the son-in-law. So they had a, for lack of a word, a lineage high priest, Annas, and an acting by civil law government Roman Caiaphas. And here's what I'm trying to get you to appreciate. It's interesting to me that they were able to maintain the high priesthood simply by heritage. One is put into the position, he dies, next one up, without any biblical record of that. Right? We know it happens, and we know there were guidelines that governed it. We don't have a lot of detail about how it happened, exactly when it happened, who took over when, right? It's just when you're thinking about this, it's just interesting that it was not apparently something that God prioritized. In all of the historical recordings of things that God shares with us in the pages of the Bible, it just wasn't something that He addressed in sharing that information with us. There could be all kinds of reasons for that, and all would be speculative. here's again what I'm trying to get us to appreciate. They could look back at all that history. We may not be able to read any of that record of that history, but they could look back and remember all the history they'd been shared with all those years, and they would probably find good and bad high priests. They would find men who honored what God wanted, and they would find men not so much. And none of them would still rise to whom? To Jesus. None of them would ever amount to rise to. Why would you want to go back to that system when none of them, though they were important, though they fulfilled a purpose, though they were designed, governed, rules about, all of that is true. But none of them would rise up to the same level as Jesus does. Your thoughts, questions? I'll listen for a second.
The reason is because they all died and he lives.
Yeah. Yeah.
The high priest that's alive.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting. Why would you look to go back to a dead system when you've been quickened and made alive in the power of Jesus? I'll come back.
God made them be so adorned with robes of high quality just for the purpose of the show when they make sacrifices for the people. Yet they still have the weaknesses of the people.
You'd be pretty easy to distinguish him, right? When you see the decor and the manner in which they would present themselves, and yet they still had the very same weaknesses and infirmities and humanity that needed the forgiveness of God and the sacrifices that were being offered, just like everyone else.
About the priesthood.
Okay.
So when Aaron died, his oldest son,
Right.
Eleazar, and then after him, his oldest son
Right.
took over. And the scriptures is in Numbers 20, 25 to 28, Deuteronomy 10:6.
Right. So we have the initial passing of the high priest on. It's the everything in between this moment here in the history of Jesus back to them that we don't have a lot of knowledge about. But you do have an example. You're right. When it initially is developed to be able to pass down from Aaron, and we know that two of the sons got in trouble, right, because they chose to circumvent, right, and were consumed by that fire. That's Nadab and Abihu, correct? So those gentlemen, and we studied just not that long ago about the fact that it's very unusual when you think about the fact that they're destroyed at the power of God, and Aaron and Eleazar have to keep on doing the priestly duties even after that event occurs. When we talked, if you recall, several weeks ago about law and spirit of law and Aaron's situation. Yeah. To not do those traditional mourning time and things that happen.
And Zechariah, I looked at it, it said that, he was burning incense. He was chosen by Lot.
Yeah.
You know, they
To serve in that
basically threw
capacity.
a stone in the bag with your initial and pulled one out.
Absolutely.
So it wasn't a election or a popularity contest, because it said that no one takes this honor for himself. In other words, they don't promote themselves.
Right.
Because-
And that's the next thing we need to make sure we see is that the point is they did not promote themselves into that position, and even Jesus didn't say, I'm going to be the high priest. Who decided that? God the Father did. The Father decided. So also, verse 5, also Christ glorified not himself to be made an high priest, but he that said unto him, Thou art my son, today have I begotten thee. Any biblical references that's, I'm trying to think. Is there a connecting text to verse 5?
Well, 1 of Hebrews says about the same thing.
Okay.
Where he said that not even an angel could be declared the high priest.
Right? Any other? Yeah. So in Psalm 2, there's a reference to this very same language. Thou art my son, today have I begotten thee. And so you could appreciate that this mindset has already been established. Then you see it when Jesus' baptism, God elevates him. And you have these moments of times where God makes sure folks understand that he's elevated his son into various positions. This conversation is about how he's developed him into a new high priest. As he saith also in another place, thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Who is he? Okay, so biblical record, Genesis, all right? 14, I believe. So you go back to Genesis 14, and you will find there was a king, and then there's this man, Melchizedek, described as the high priest in that area. And the significance in that moment, by the way, is the fact that he actually comes and blesses who? Abraham, that's right. He comes and actually blesses Abraham in that scene, and it kind of illustrates that Abraham, at that point in time, was even taking precedent over Melchizedek, who's described as a high priest. So, why reference that when it comes to Jesus?
Long before the priestly order is set in stone.
Okay, so it backs you up to prior to the heritage of Aaron that was required for high priest. Why else? Okay, so we don't know how he became, and we don't know how. And Jesus is Alpha and Omega, right? Beginning and end. That's another connector that we have between Jesus and Melchizedek. What else? I'm just getting you to think for a minute.
The name Melchizedek means,
Now you got me. So, anybody have a definition of his name offhand?
King of Righteousness.
Okay, there you go. So there's a connect, right? In the righteousness of Jesus. What else? I'm just okay.
Both the king and the priest.
Okay. Yes, a king and a priest, and that connectivity. So, right? Yep. And no one higher than him in that time period. Let me rephrase the question now. Why is it important to have this conversation with an audience that he's writing this letter to the Hebrews? If you say Jesus is a high priest, what's the first thing one of those guys is going to say? Because there's one in every class. Yeah, he's not even a Levite, right? That's the first thing they're going to say is, what do you mean that he's a high priest? He can't even be a priest because he's not a Levite, let alone fit the description of one who could be a high priest. So the writer just dispels that. He removes that argument right off the bat by saying, listen, he's a high priest, and I'm going to tell you right now, he's not the kind of high priest you're thinking about.
It's stated after the order of Melchizedek.
Yeah.
Melchizedek was not a Levite.
Yeah.
Neither was Christ.
Right.
So that the order that God used there was that. They was different than the other high priest after Aaron.
Yeah. Right, he's even before Abraham. He's not even part of that lineage.
He was the king of Salem who received tithes from Abraham in Genesis 14, 18 through 20, who was also depicted as a type of Christ because of his endless priesthood.
Yeah. And because we don't know when it started, we don't know when, and he's obviously part of the patriarchs, not part of the Mosaic system, just very different. I'm getting questions coming from every side of me right now, so I'm trying to. I'd have to look at that. But there's all kinds of comparisons. I just wanted you to walk that path for a minute. But the conversation goes to Jesus, verse 7, who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with strong crying and tears unto him that was able to save him from death, and was heard in that he feared. Oh, there's a lot. There's a lot there. He prays. We know that happened. Well, it happened a lot, right, in the life of Jesus. That's probably a reference to what? His prayers where? In the garden, right? In the Garden of Gethsemane, when he prays 3 times, if it be thy will, let this cup pass. Is there any other way? Right? That's kind of the messaging of that prayer. Is there any other way? Can this cup pass from me? Do I have to drink this cup? Do I have to do this? Is there some other means by which? And he does that with strong crying and tears. And you go back into those narratives that describe those prayers that he offers in the garden. You can see the sweat pouring out of him, and just the amazing tumult and torture in a sense that he's going through. But I want you to think about something else that's said in this verse that's anyway, just think about it. So he's presenting all this to whom? Unto God, unto him that was able to what? What's that mean? I'm just trying to get you to think about what the implication of that is. What could God have done? He could have stopped it. He could have. Now, we could have that long discussion, right? It would breach the character of God. He can't lie about the promises he made before the foundations of the world. I get all that, right? I get all that. But the implication of that is that when Jesus is in agony in the garden and he's pouring out his heart to the Father and he's pleading, let this cup pass from me. God the Father had power to do it. He had power to do it. Remember, the Father's only obligated to whom? To himself. He's only obligated to himself. And so he could choose whatever it is. Now, what did Jesus find a way to bypass the cross? No, okay. So then in what way was he heard? So if he didn't, right, he's praying to be saved. Let this cup pass from me. The Father had power to do it, but it wasn't what he did because he still suffered the consequences of the cross. So in what way was Jesus' prayers heard?
Well, God heard them, but he also said, not my will, your will be done.
Right? So Jesus always, right, concludes those prayers with an understanding of God the Father's will. In what other ways was Jesus heard in these prayers? And you're hinting at it. I just want to make sure we flesh this out a little bit.
He could have called on them.
Okay? And yeah, we could see how his human side. I'm just trying to, right? Because the Hebrew writer's got some reason he said that. There's some reason why he's wanting to convey to that audience of people. Because if you know the account, now I guess I don't have any way to know whether that audience that he writes this letter to would have been familiar with the account of Jesus' prayers in the garden. I would imagine they would have been part of what those disciples were sharing with folks when the message of Jesus was being spread. And my point is, these folks knew that his prayer wasn't answered in the affirmative. They knew, at least the author did, that Jesus prayed, but he didn't get exactly what he was asking for, let this cup pass from me. And yet it was possible that even though that he didn't receive exactly what he'd asked for, that he was still heard. And we know there was comfort put forth. And what I want us to simply appreciate is that we have a high priest who we can put forth our challenges before, and the infirmities and the difficulties and the needs that we may have. We can put those before the high priest to be presented to the Father. And sometimes the answer of the Father is no, and the high priest understands exactly what that's like. The high priest was heard. Jesus, the high priest, was heard, even though he didn't receive exactly what he had asked for. When we approach the throne of God with boldness, through Jesus, the high priest, be comforted in knowing that even Jesus himself experienced what it is like to not receive exactly what we prayed for. He is legitimately a high priest who was touched with our infirmities and sorrows and challenges and understands us when we approach him, even in things like that. Go ahead, Bob.
The writer here is trying to tell the Hebrew people, though Christ was praying in the garden, he had the appearance of a man, he was a man. And he suffered everything that normal people suffer. And that Christ learned obedience even unto death by going to the cross. And that the Hebrews are going to have to learn obedience through their suffering.
Yeah, and we're going to get to that here shortly, but it is important for them to appreciate, right, that even though he was a son, he still had to fulfill. So let's tie that a little bit. So go back to the conclusion of his prayers, not my will but thine be done. He's heard, and what God hears is the voice of an obedient child, an obedient son who says, I'd rather not do this, but I'll finish it. Not my will, but yours be done. And sometimes I think we need to appreciate the realities of his prayers in the garden. And not just the overwhelming sorrow of what was to come, not just the agony of knowing what he was about to experience through the humiliations and the scourging and all of the awful things that people are going to say and do to him over the next short period of time. But that he beseeches the Father, but was willing to let the hearing of the Father be obedient to this. Finish this. And the power of the high priest is magnified when you appreciate that. And was heard in that he feared, respected, was in awe of his own Father. And then that thought that Bob shared, though he were a son, yet learned he obedience by the things which he suffered, and being made perfect, he became the author of eternal salvation unto all them that obey him. Yeah, it's interesting. sometimes we'll talk about the verse 8. We'll talk about the importance of being obedient, and we'll talk about how it's important for us to, if the Son had to do it, we have to do it. But don't forget, this is stated in context of how Jesus becomes the permanent high priest. And he does so by fulfilling the will and purposes of the Father. He didn't choose it. Go back to the earlier verses. He wasn't voted for it. He didn't right, try to promote himself into this role. He respected, feared the plans and purposes of the Father. And even though he was a son in the glory of his Father's home, he still honored what God had said. I'll come back to that, Lord willing, on Sunday. And we'll start there at that point and have a little longer conversation concerning that.